Ofensiva rusa hacia Zaporizhzhia.
Russian offensive towards Zaporizhzhia. Today's Russian advances are the unmistakable proof of what we predicted on this channel days ago. Russia has indeed launched an offensive towards Zaporizhzhia. Desperation in Ukraine. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From Berlin, Germany, we begin broadcast number 280 of Demolishing Myths Live. Thank you very much for joining us. And please remember to help us with a thumbs up against censorship, as well as through subscriptions, comments, memberships, for those who can, and of course, through our PayPal account as well. In this broadcast, we will focus on the Russian offensive towards Zaporizhzhia, something predicted here on this channel days ago. And evidently, in light of what has happened over the past 5 days, this offensive has indeed finally begun.
Ofensiva finalmente comenzó. Presentemos primero el contexto.
Let's first present the context, and little by little carry out an analysis of what has happened over the last 5 or 6 days, more or less up to today. From there, we can, or we will, present the possible scenarios for Russia from this point on, within the framework of this meeting. First, the context of the military situation in general. As you will all recall, we are witnessing a war of attrition in which Russia shows a clear superiority in human and material resources. If we want to go back to a point roughly within the last few months, and one that is significant for reconstructing what has happened as the context for this offensive, we might return to the Ukrainian offensive in Kursk, naturally a failed one, after which the Ukrainians carried out, without much military sense, an advance, a penetration into that territory.
Un avance, una penetración en este territorio. Desde aquí, desde el primer día, vaticinamos el fracaso.
From here, from day one, we predicted the failure of that offensive, which had no purpose other than to create media impact. And we also anticipated what happened afterward. The fact that, once all the territories taken by Ukraine within Russian borders were reconquered, Russia could begin an offensive into Ukrainian territory, particularly toward the city of Sumy, the capital city located in that area, this one here, with the goal of creating a buffer zone, right? I'm presenting this from last year as the first step toward the current situation. Well, Russia began that offensive and made very, very rapid advances, which caused a great deal of nervousness and concern in Ukraine, and led the Ukrainians to immediately and urgently redeploy troops to Sumy to contain this offensive.
Para la contención de esta ofensiva. Claro, como aparecemos en una guerra de desgaste.
Of course, since we're in a war of attrition, with one side having superiority in human and material resources over the other, any movement of Ukrainian resources toward a particular place, in this case towards Sumy, due to the danger of a Russian penetration reaching the capital of the Sumy Oblast, immediately resulted in the weakening and lack of protection of many other areas along the front. And that's how the strong advances in Pokrovsk began, where the Russians kept making more and more progress, both directly and laterally, encircling the city. But not only that, when the Ukrainians began sending troops to defend Pokrovsk, the logistical and defensive hub of the entire southern Donetsk region, the Russians immediately started making new advances.
Entonces, los rusos comenzaron a realizar avances más arriba, por sobre todas las cosas aquí.
Higher up, above all else, here in Kupiansk, another very important city, also encircled by the Russians. This game, in a way like cat and mouse between the attacker, Russia, and the defender, shows Russia's ability to create a destabilizing effect in the offensive. That naturally determines the need to reassign Ukraine's resources, troops, and weapons toward that attacked region. And then, right there, Russia strikes along the rest of the contact line until it creates a new point of penetration. And once again, we witness the same story: the reassignment of Ukrainian troops there, as in Pokrovsk, and the opening of a new front in Kupiansk. We can of course extend this analysis to what has happened in the north, both here and in Bolchansk.
Sucedido en el norte, tanto aquí en Volchansk. Ya vamos a presentar lo sucedido hoy, pero simplemente...
We're going to present what happened today, but I just want to describe the logic behind this sort of dam, with water behind it and little holes appearing here and there, here and there. The Ukrainians are responding as best they can, plugging those little holes, patching them up, but they're multiplying faster and faster. Holes are appearing, gaps are opening in this dam, larger and in more and more places. So Ukraine can no longer respond quickly enough, and that causes the amount of water passing through those holes to accelerate, to rise higher and higher, until logically, at some point, the dam collapses entirely and all the water rushes through, in this improvised dam analogy.
En esta analogía improvisada de un dique. Bueno, en Volchansk también algo parecido cuando
Well, something similar happened in Bolchansk. When the Ukrainians responded, above all in Pokrovsk, an advance began in Bolchansk after a long period of stagnation there, as well as in this area, not very significant in military terms, but one where the Russians managed to open a new front, in a way, here in the northern part of Luhansk. Actually, this is already the Kharkiv Oblast area, and in that context, from Sumy to Pokrovsk, to Kupiansk to Bolchansk, over the past week, we saw the latest point of Russian penetration in this cat-and-mouse game, which began precisely farther south, in an area the Russians had barely worked until now, basically the Dnipropetrovsk region. This oblast here, still unclaimed by the Russians, with its capital, Dnipro, located on the banks of the Dnipro River, much farther west, and only Pavlograd as the only somewhat important city between the current combat zone and the city center.
Punto actual de combates hasta el centro de la ciudad y por otro lado los ataques rusos y los avances rusos.
And on the other hand, the Russian attacks and advances, above all else, began here in Zaporizhzhia, this province, or rather this oblast, already claimed by the Russians as their own and included in the Russian constitution. Remember that after Russia's initial territorial claims, its political demands were always the same. Basically, Ukraine's neutrality with respect to NATO, the main cause of the start of this war. Secondly, demilitarization, denazification, the protection of the Russian-speaking population, ethnically Russian, of what is Russian itself. Protection, nothing more, respect for it, not its imposition, far from it, only protection.
No su imposición, ni mucho menos, solamente la protección, y eso, perdón, desde lo político y desde...
And that, from both a political and military standpoint, Russia initially only wanted, basically, the recognition of the pro-Russian separatist oblasts of Ukraine, Luhansk and Donetsk. But after the war truly began, not as an intra-Ukrainian or intra-Russian conflict, but as the living expression of a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia in Ukraine, and even as a clash between the old, decaying unipolar order and the rising multipolar order, with China, naturally, on Russia's side, as well as the BRICS. Although they are not participating in the conflict, they are naturally aligned in this historical crossroads, in this civilizational confrontation between the declining global north and the ascending global south. Well, once this war openly began as a confrontation over much more than Ukraine, that's when Putin, that's when Russia, decided that it not only wanted recognition of the peoples of Donetsk and the People's Republic of Luhansk, but that those republics, in fact, from that point on, represented a constitutive part of Russia. And not only those republics, those regions, but also Zaporizhzhia and Kherson.
Zaporizhzhia y Kherson. Curiosamente, Dnipropetrovsk
Curiously, Dnipropetrovsk still doesn't appear among Russia's current territorial demands. Patience, demolishers, patience, because making progress for Russia throughout this region without advancing toward Dnipro, as well as toward Kharkiv and Odessa in the south, makes no sense at all. Russia is in an existential confrontation, in the sense that its defeat would determine its end, or perhaps the beginning of a world war, and in that case, the disappearance of the entire world.
El mundo, sí, en el caso de una guerra mundial, y para eso, para la garantía de su seguridad.
And for that, to guarantee its security, it can no longer just create a buffer with Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson, but must establish a much broader area. And not only that, but it must also determine that the remaining Ukraine, the Ukraine of the future, the Ukraine reduced simply to the ultra-nationalist Ukraine associated with NATO, should not possess military capabilities, or perhaps even consider the elimination of its armed forces, or have armed forces that are very, very limited.
Fuerzas armadas muy pero muy reducidas. No solo eso, sino que Rusia además debe generar las condiciones.
Not only that, but Russia must also create the conditions for that NATO imperialist springboard project toward Eastern Europe to ultimately become a failure. This is the broader context, and forgive me for presenting such a large framework when what I really want is to focus on the offensive towards Zaporizhzhia. But we must always provide context in order to somehow make sense of things, where this offensive appears, why Russia wants the capture of Zaporizhzhia, what the background is, and what the geopolitical context looks like, both regionally here in Ukraine and on a Eurasian and global scale. That said, dear demolishers, we can now move on to the concrete developments, what everyone wants, the geopolitical advances.
Todo el mundo quiere los avances. Podemos retroceder hasta el día 6.
We can go back to the 6th. I'm not going to present. Sorry, we were already on the 6th. I'm not going to show all the videos and all the material that document these developments, because we showed most of it yesterday with Fernando. I'll only present what's new and maybe something very important from the last few days. Well, this is the current situation. The 6th, about a week ago. The encirclement in Pokrovsk and in Kupiansk, once again, somehow became the center of attention, logically, because of Ukraine's desperate situation and the Russian advances. And in that context, suddenly the new development, the news of advances both in the Zaporizhzhia area here and in the Dnipropetrovsk area further north.
Dnipropetrovsk más arriba. Comencemos a recorrer día tras día. Esto el día 6.
Let's start going through it day by day. This is day 6. Let's bring it a little closer. Maybe the map will help us that way. Russia was already pounding, logically, its targets in this manner, with bombs, with attacks, with drones, with conventional artillery. This is always the preliminary step. Without a doubt, in a war characterized by the massive introduction of drones, it's clear that in the Russian preparatory and preliminary attacks, drones appear much more than in the past. Or almost. Yes, in the past they practically didn't take part. But in some way they follow the Soviet and later Russian military doctrine of carrying out prior work of pounding and pounding with artillery.
Machacar y machacar con la artillería. Si antes, básicamente, con la artillería y con las fuerzas.
If before it was basically with artillery and air forces through bombings, now it's with artillery, the air force and its bombings, and also with drones. But basically, the military doctrine is the same. First carry out preparatory work, destruction, attrition, exhaustion, and then begin the advances. That's how we began on the 6th. That day there were already several developments. The confirmed capture of Uspinivka, and the advances towards Solotke.
Avances hacia Solotke, por aquí algunas de las imágenes, estas difundidas.
Here we have some of the images. These were released by the Russians that day. Let's move through this a bit faster. We'll show all the videos at an accelerated speed. Well, the Ukrainian retreat. I'm presenting this very carefully. I have no intention of showing violent images, dead people, or anything gruesome. Sometimes, unintentionally, something might appear. What matters here is the withdrawal of the Ukrainian forces. Pay attention to this image, which recalls the early years of the war. Do you remember those images of fields that looked like the surface of the moon, full of craters, battered by conventional artillery, and of course by mines as well? Well, today, because of the speed of the advances and the change in the nature of the war, the focus on drones instead of conventional artillery, yes, there are some artillery craters, but far, far fewer.
Mucho, bueno, con cuidado, mucho, ahí sacando a alguien herido. Bueno, el escape de...
There, pulling someone out who's injured. Well, this is the retreat of the Russians that day, and here are the images of the retreat of the Ukrainians that day, and here the advance of the Russian forces. We're always showing, well, here the advances. First, the preparatory work, mainly with drones. And today, drones not only carry out attacks, not only strike targets, but also constantly monitor the situation. Here, the advance of the Russian troops. That was the first day. All of this already confirmed as Russian at that time. And reports of further advances toward Solotny, reports of advances toward Nove, this whole area described as contested. That means, if before it was 7 days, now it's about 6 days. 1 day later, as a demonstration of how fast all this is happening, suddenly, new reports. On one hand, confirmation of the capture further north of Ripny, verified by video. Here again, the work is conventional artillery, monitored by a drone. Now the precise work of drones. Nowadays, drones can not only carry out an attack against a specific target in a house or at a position previously identified by a monitoring drone, but they can also practically move through a house, entering through any hole, any window, any open door, until the soldiers taking shelter there are eliminated. Well, this is confirmed. This is apparently the same video, yes. And above all, that day, this here, confirmed. The previous day, also confirmed. And that same day, the announcement of advances toward this locality of Solotny, as well as toward the locality of Nove, over here. And pay attention to this type of advance. The defensive forces positioned here, clearly forming a first defensive line between Orehov, Uliapoli, and all these fortified positions. The Russians, instead of attacking head-on, basically through this flanking maneuver, this operation to the east of all these towns, begin to advance in parallel behind the defensive lines, leaving all of this basically undefended, or very poorly defended. This happened on the 9th. The next day, well, confirmation of the entire advance in a single day, yes, in just 1 day, several kilometers, and the capture of a new town here in Solopke, and down here as well, also Solopke, and here, Novouspennitke. This entire area was taken in a single day, most likely around here. Images every day, images of new advances. Pay attention to the huge advance that day. Once again, the repeated pounding beforehand, also logically against armored vehicles. And finally, the Russians raising the flag. All of this, of course, carried out by the Vostok Special Forces Group, made up mainly of Chechen forces, though not exclusively. One of the most feared Russian units of all, with extensive experience here, at least since 2014, and some perhaps with experience going back to the Chechen Wars, no less. If Russians, in general, are tough guys, the Chechens are even tougher, one of the toughest groups in all of Russia. The toughest of the tough are here. Ukrainians are also very tough. Watch out. Here, all these Russian peoples are very hardened, very strong, big, resilient people, hardened by the cold. If there's one thing these fighters don't lack, it's courage. They're all very brave and have great endurance. We must always remember this, both about the Russian fighters and the Ukrainian fighters. If troops from other countries were here, they would have disappeared long ago with their tails between their legs. Well, in addition, that same day there were also announcements of advances toward this town here, Yablukovo and Rytnopilia. Once again, the Russian tactic of advancing behind the defensive line. That's the pattern of Russian advances. This was 2 days ago. No, not 2 days. That was on the 10th, so 3 days ago then. Well, yesterday, no, the day before yesterday, once again confirmed Russian advances around here, in this area. All this area of fields, previously reported as disputed, is now confirmed, and an advance operation toward Yablukovo, once again behind the defensive lines, now confirmed. Documenting the advance, the same thing again, right?
Lo mismo, ¿sí? Bien. Día de...
Well, yesterday. And by the way, it's clear here that Russia intends to carry out exactly the same operation with Uliapol, the same type of attack. Instead of a frontal assault against all these defenses, an attack from the rear. Yesterday, new reports came in, not only about this offensive, but also about its expansion to the sides, including Rivnopilia and south towards Solovnitske. Also, and this was yesterday's new development, advances toward Danilivka, another point of penetration in this area, no longer in Zaporizhzhia, but in Dnipropetrovsk, further north. This has even been confirmed by Ukrainian mappers. Apparently, the objective, and we discussed this with Fernando yesterday, is Uliai Pol. Now then, this, today. And while the Russians will very likely attack Uliai Pol from behind very soon, they could also be launching a much deeper offensive right now towards Zaporizhzhia and Pavlohrad, with Dnipro as the objective. So let's present today's situation with many new developments. Once again, all of this is being carried out by the Special Forces, the Vostok Group, and the drone unit known as Rubicon, formerly called the Rubicon Center for Advanced Unmanned Technologies. This is basically the drone unit of the Russian armed forces deployed along the entire front. And by the way, speaking of drones, today the Russians announced the formal establishment of a branch of the Russian armed forces specialized in drones, just as there are the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, the Space Forces, and the Strategic Forces. Now, such is the importance of drones that the world's major armed forces are already creating a new branch, not just introducing drones into the Army, the Navy, or however they call it in their respective countries, or into the Air Forces. No, a separate branch altogether. That's how fundamentally and strategically important drones are today. Well, let's start from the bottom up and present the entire front all the way to the top, because we're going to witness many new developments.
Presenciar muchas novedades. Bueno, primero, avances.
Well, first, Russian advances capturing Rivnopilia and Yablokov. These are the towns of Rivnopilia and Yablokov. This already even appears here on the Deep State map, a pro-Ukrainian mapper that confirms this advance. Remember where this started, right? Around the 6th, roughly around here. The advances in this direction are tremendous. Practically every day between 500 meters and 2 kilometers in a war of attrition. Here's the Deep State map, my apologies. This is the Deep State map. And not only here, already flattening the entire front, but also to the south here in Chevron, where there are also new advances. With the clear objective of encirclement and flanking, the maneuver around Ulia and Pol, right? Further up, still significant. Well, this is already from Nikopol, but still part of the offensive in Zaporizhzhia. The new development, not only confirmation of what was mentioned before, but also new advances here toward Danilivka. This, obviously, in the direction of Zaporizhzhia, and what's important here appears precisely in a video, perhaps visible on the road in question. There, the video shows barbed wire, some kind of structures, fortifications, destroyed vehicles, and so on. This is just from today, right? Well, there you have it, folks, so we won't present that one. It's the same one, isn't it? Yes, the same one, showing the advance toward Danilivka. Why is this important? Because the Russians have finally caused the disruption of the P85 highway, which is essential for supplying Uliai Pol. This is the highway, going up this way, now cut off here by the Russians, on the way to Pokrovsky and Alexandritska. That's the strategic importance of this advance further north. In any case, remember that at this point, these advances here, as in this whole area, clearly serve the objective of Zaporizhzhia. To keep causing destruction, to keep conquering step by step, in this case to take Uliai Pol first, then Orihiv, and so on. They're going to carry out a direct advance through here, no doubt. Well, that basically aligns with the ultimate goal in Zaporizhzhia.
Bien. Más al norte.
Alright, farther north. In Dnipro there are also new Russian advances in Orestopil and Ivanivka. If the map helps me, this, Orestopil and Novonitka. Just now looking at this on the map, Orestopil, if it helps me, well, it has now unfortunately been lost. Here. Now, yes, at first alright, my apologies. Well, here's Ivanivka. These are the new advances in this area, both toward, in Orestopil's case, Yavirivka, the initial objective, logically, but here this penetration already has another mission, another point of, another direction, another orientation. The objective after this, evidently, basically corresponds to an advance farther north. If this helps me here, now yes, this advance, yes, clearly corresponds to the objective of Pavlograd, farther north.
Pavlograd, evidentemente, más al norte. Por cierto, por ahí...
By the way, there's a rather interesting and substantial analysis by a Western military analyst precisely about the Russians' strategic decision now with these advances, both here and in this area. The objective, obviously, is in Zaporizhzhia, but logic would suggest that they would first take this route. However, according to this military analyst, obviously pro-Ukrainian, but sometimes with more or less serious analyses, the Russians could, from now on, instead of advancing directly toward Uliaipol from these two salients, push forward in this direction. That's one of the possible hypotheses, right? Areas practically without defenses, with only one line here, and quite a secondary one, by the way.
Y bastante secundaria, por cierto, y de esa manera, de esa misma forma, generar...
And in that way, in that same manner, to create disruption in both the Uliaipol and Orehov supply chains, and, logically, an advance towards Zaporizhzhia, with basically total confusion and complete disorder among Russian troops, deeply entrenched in the rear of this entire area, as well as in this other area. Right? That's one possibility. The alternatives are basically those two. The objective is always the same, throughout this area here, obviously Zaporizhzhia. The Russians could then do this, and at the same time this. Or instead of carrying out this entire route, they could create a historic breakthrough here, and from there move to the rear, and also generate internal chaos along the entire front line.
Generar un caos interno en toda la línea del frente. Esas las dos posibilidades básicamente en esta zona.
Those are basically the two possibilities in this area. Here, further up, in the two advances mentioned earlier today, in Orestopil, now finally identified here, and Ivanivka, the two most important current advances of the day, this one here and this one here, the objectives are clear. First, here Pokrovsk and this last defensive line in this area, Velika Novosilka. But after that, logically, what do the Russians want? This here, Pavlograd as the last point of defense before Dnipro, right? That's the logic of this whole area. In Rostov over here, we need to show the image properly there. Yes, perfect. Well, here, in Rostov, in Pokrovsk, Rostov, quite far from here, by the way, in Pokrovsk, some important developments today.
En Pokrovsk, algunas novedades importantes el día de hoy. Primero, al oeste, aquí en
First, to the west, here in this area, significant advances across the whole region. Fires once again linked to the push westward. Surely after this, the next objective, Ripny. But once again, this here no longer corresponds to the encirclement of Pokrovsk, but rather to the eventual offensive toward Pavlograd and then toward Dnipro. The Russians here are already focusing on that. As for Pokrovsk itself, today the Russians captured this last part of the city. Here, some images. These images basically show the level of destruction. Ah, good, I'll show it again. Here on the left, the model of each of the destroyed vehicles. This one is a Max Pro, American, all Ukrainian armored vehicles. Here, a Kirpi, BMC Kirpi, Turkish.
Aquí un Kirpi, BMC Kirpi, turco. Arriba, a la derecha, vamos recorriendo este camino.
Up ahead, on the right, we're following this path, if you can even call it a road. A dirt road, gravel, right? And with this drone, we're witnessing the situation, okay? Just in this area, on the outskirts, there's a Canadian senator, a Ukrainian vehicle. Here's another one, Canadian, to the left, another unmarked one. Here, what else? Onsilla. Novata, a Ukrainian Novator, the Onsilla, from Poland. HMMWV, so many of them. BVS, a Swedish armored vehicle 10. This one, Kirpi, what an amount of money and resources sent by the West, by NATO, for this unbelievable war. And then here, there's no money left for education, for healthcare, for all the most basic things.
para la salud, para todas las cosas más básicas, la cantidad de dinero, además de la muerte de
The amount of money, in addition to the deaths, is obviously tied to the shipment of weapons. What a quantity of resources devoted to the most ignoble aspects of humanity, right? NATO's imperial war. Well, there are pickups, regular trucks, another one there. Here once again, Jabatop, all Ukrainians. Yusa Ukrainian, another Ukrainian armored vehicle. Ah, the ball. There's still quite a bit more video left. Let's speed it up. What a number of vehicles. I didn't remember this video. Tremendous, tremendous. It goes through the outskirts of Pokrovsk, right? More. There began an area with protective nets for drones. This one, obviously, a tethered drone. What tethered drones can cover nowadays?
Cableado, lo que pueden recorrer los drones cableados hoy. Increíble, por eso la calidad de la imagen.
Incredible. That's why the image quality, and that's why the image is free from electronic warfare interference. This is a drone with a cable behind it, with fiber optics. More vehicles everywhere. Well, cars too, naturally, increasingly used for their speed. Stripped down cars, without doors, so they can be abandoned at the moment of drone impact. Destruction too, of the roads, of everything along the sides. Well, there are drone nets again, but completely destroyed. Anti-drone nets. There's another armored vehicle, Senator American M113. Interesting video, I didn't remember it. Pickups, another Humvee. Ah, so many. What a number of good.
Bien. Todos esos vehículos no militares también usados por los militares.
All those non-military vehicles are also used by the military. Those cars and those trucks, obviously, used by the military as well. It's already an area largely free of civilians. Well, they went through this area, basically. Well, here, images. This is the confirmation of hits on Russian soldiers. That's why it confirms that this, with Russian presence, happened. Further down, a video released by the Ukrainians, supposedly showing the vehicles lost by the Russians. But in reality, if we go through the video, we see Russian vehicles lost during the entry, in the capture of Pokrovsk. But there are also Ukrainian vehicles. A bit of everything.
Vehículos ucranianos, un poco de todo. Mucho material destruido.
A lot. Really a lot. A huge amount of material destroyed. Alright, here's the image. This is in Pokrovsk, practically already fully taken, and once again with the western flank already under Russian control, moving toward Rizhne, the next step. Updates in the south, between yesterday and today, the confirmed capture here of Sushnishar, the last town south of Minograd. Minograd, this city here, part of the urban core of Pokrovsk, but well, in some way, an independent city, and still under Ukrainian control as of today, though less and less so. This was from yesterday. Remember that yesterday, the Russians pounded buildings with bombs, like this one, right? Pay attention to the shockwave at the beginning of the video. These panel buildings, Soviet-era buildings, very tough, and yet the shockwave from that huge blast was tremendous. And yesterday too, images, all of this, from yesterday. Now we're going to show today's material, footage already showing the entry of Russian soldiers. Here's one of them. Also, today actually, a video of surrenders right in that area. That video, I have it outside this map. Well, unfortunately it didn't load, so I won't be able to show it. But there are videos of a mass surrender of around 15 to 20 soldiers. Maybe that's why, along with these bombings, the airstrike campaign, and the advance of Russian troops, today's report mentions a substantial advance on the eastern flank of the city of Minograd. These are today's Russian advances, extremely important ones. Minograd, to paraphrase Fernando, just a few newscasts away, nothing more. In a few days, obviously, the city of Minograd will be completely conquered. These are today's advances. With a second of patience from the monitors, I'm going to show it because this is the video of several soldiers surrendering. It's not downloaded yet, but I can, right here very quickly, with everyone's patience. There we go. Yes, if you could help me. This one here. There we go, this one. No, not this one. Let's see. What a thing, just a second, here's the video.
Un segundito, aquí el video. Ah, sí, es efectivamente el video. Sí, mala mía. Es el video.
Ah, yes, that's indeed the video. Yes, my bad, it's the correct video. Now, in just a couple more seconds, the television moment. Well, here's the destruction of this, without music. Destruction of vehicles, whoa, 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 careful with that, etc., etc. And later on, well, this is the moment in the video. The moment when they document the surrender of a relatively large group of soldiers. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, apparently. Maybe that's the reason for such major advances. There's one wounded. Yes, more than 15. Clearly more than 15. According to reports, the lives of all these soldiers were spared, taken as prisoners, and that's it. Possibly the combination of yesterday's tremendous bombings with, well, these are the documents of these poor captured people. The combination of yesterday's bombings and these surrenders may have led to such a large Russian advance in such a difficult area as this one, all in a single day. Well, just a few newscasts here. Fernando sticks it, still pending for Minograd. In a couple of days, they're going to capitulate completely. A little further north, what happened in this area is interesting, a key area, because from this northern pincer, the Russians were able to create the encirclement of both Minograd and Pokrovsk. In recent days, the Ukrainians have made enormous efforts, with many armored vehicles, to launch a counter-offensive in this area and try to open up this pocket, or somehow, through this advance, widen this exit corridor, or, failing that, directly destroy this pocket. Something quite unlikely, not to say impossible. Well, today, the Ukrainians themselves were showing images of attacks on Russian soldiers. We're not going to show that, but, well, on Russian soldiers in this area. So either the Russians initially retreated in the face of this armored counter-offensive and have already retaken it, or they never completely abandoned it, and at least part of it still appears to be contested. The Russians claim to have secure control of this area, ensuring the northern flank of this pocket. A little further up, this is in Radinsky. Yes, in fact, according to this mapper, yesterday the Ukrainians had retaken this area here, and evidently today the Russians are once again making advances toward what was taken a few days ago. This is the nonsense behind these Russian operations. Facing territories already taken by the Russians, with no possibility of defense, they launch yet another counter-offensive to create a media image more than anything else. Because in the end, they simply delay the inevitable at the cost of countless lives and enormous resources. They recapture something for a day, and the next day the Russians take it all back again, at the cost of the deaths of many soldiers who would be much better used farther back, in a defensive zone, in a fortified position, located a bit more in the rear. But well, this is the logic of war for Zelensky and for Ukraine. A logic that's more media-driven, often, than military. Over here, there are also new developments in this area, in the Yajova region. Here, perhaps the only quote-unquote success for Ukraine, also at the cost of many casualties. At one point, the Russians launched, in this back and forth, a very fast and surprising offensive. Once again, from Kursk to Pokrovsk, from Pokrovsk to Kupiansk, from Kupiansk to Volchansk, from Volchansk to the southern area, to Zaporizhzhia, to Dnipropetrovsk. At one point, the Russians attacked these small villages around here. They had conquered quite a bit more, even up to here, if I remember correctly. Well, but obviously without consolidation, right? For reconnaissance, for penetration, but without consolidating such a deep advance, and with open flanks. At the cost of many units, they managed to reconquer this. but the Russians responded by widening the base of this salient in that direction. And they created the encirclement of Yazhove, this city here, which according to today's reports is practically taken, completely surrounded. There, for example. This needs to be handled carefully, because Russian soldiers are entering. Well, we're not going to show it, but surely this could be drone attacks, or the advance of the Russians. It may just be a demonstration of the Russians entering these positions around there. Just in case, I'm not going to show it, because there might be an attack on a soldier, or some gruesome image. Here in Yazhove, perhaps the only success of the Ukrainian counteroffensives was against an advance, whose goal was really the concentration of Ukrainian troops in this area, rather than any real push beyond it, before the capture of Konstantinivka. From this whole axis upward, with Kramatorsk, with Sloviansk, before the closure of Pokrovsk, before the closure of Kupiansk, before the advances in the north. An offensive, a Russian salient created basically in view of the possibility of a long advance, but nothing more than that. With that objective, the Ukrainians responded with everything here, leaving other areas unprotected, and that led to the exposure of many other zones, and the disastrous situation across the rest of the front. No military logic in this. None. Once again, media logic, and therefore Ukraine's desperate situation. Kupiansk here, and Kupiansk a little further up. In other areas, some interesting advances, but the situation in Kupiansk is more interesting. Here, the Ukrainians have been carrying out a counteroffensive with massed armored vehicles for days, right? What's the objective? Basically to destroy this salient and end this pocket in two parts of the Kupiansk area. And if they can liberate part of the city, even better, right? This counteroffensive is being carried out up here, and they're doing it through here and here. So far without the slightest success and with many losses. Over here, for example, a video from this area shows one armored vehicle after another being lost. In addition to the destroyed armored vehicles in the footage, there are already many vehicles destroyed along the sides, one after another, without the slightest sense. There, the soldiers abandoned the truck earlier. Same thing here, not here. Well, these are the images from Kupiansk, from this failed counteroffensive. Well, finally, in this long tour, today we carried out a broadcast like we used to, focused exclusively on military matters. But the situation is truly of enormous significance, and that's why there's a need for an analysis that is now more political than military. Perhaps, as a final point, we could present the latest advances. We had also predicted this the other day with Fernando. The latest advance took place here in Bolchansk, with the capture of another locality, Sinelkove, taken today by the Russians in the north. There are Russian advances everywhere, but the most important thing is the beginning of a deeper offensive in the south, here in the Zaporizhzhia area, and this small part of Dnipropetrovsk. The target, once again, the city of Zaporizhzhia, which means the Russians want to advance as far as the Dnipro River, which also means, obviously, that besides Zaporizhzhia, they'll want the Dnipro Oblast and the city of Dnipro. How much more will the Russians want here? Well, it's hard to determine, yes or no. Most likely yes, but that's something to be resolved much later on. Or they'll definitely want that one too. For the past 5 days, the Russians haven't carried out attacks on energy infrastructure. After those terrible attacks that went on for nearly 2 weeks, there have been no attacks in the last 5 days. no assaults on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Even so, the energy situation heading into winter looks extremely difficult for Ukraine. That's why yesterday in Kiev they showed images of the city, the trams, the subway, the streets, all in darkness, 5 days after the last massive attack on Ukraine's energy infrastructure.
Infraestructura energética ucraniana, ¿sí? Es el grado de destrucción y recuerden que Rusia no va a abandonar esta vez.
It's the degree of destruction. And remember that Russia is not going to back down this time. The Russians are not going to stop their attacks on the electrical infrastructure, the gas infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and partly also the transportation infrastructure, mostly the railways. On this subject, here is today's report from the energy supply company of the city of Poltava. For the past 5 days, this city, also quite important, has been disconnected from the Ukrainian power grid. 5 days without electricity, and directly 5 days without connection to the power grid. That's the degree of collapse of the energy situation in Ukraine.
Descalabro de la situación energética en Ucrania, todavía esta ciudad a la espera de la reconexión a la red nacional.
This city is still waiting to be reconnected to the national grid. The situation is complicated, and so is Zelensky's own situation, due to the corruption scandal linked precisely to an electric company. We might be able to present this better tomorrow, but specifically, the Anti-Corruption Office, known as NABU, is, by the way, run or controlled by external agents, basically Europeans and Americans. How curious that it's precisely now that the raids and in-depth investigations into this corruption case are beginning.
Sobre este caso de corrupción, básicamente esta agencia en los últimos
Basically, this agency, in recent days, after many announcements, finally carried out raids and exposed a corruption scheme involving massive bribery payments and money laundering. They uncovered $100 million in bribes, $100 million paid through a private energy company last year, precisely when Ukraine also seemed to be under attack against its electrical infrastructure, though much less than now, of course. Well, the officials involved, at the time the Minister of Energy, and until recently the Minister of Justice, yes, previously the Minister of Energy, left that position and was appointed to the Ministry of Justice.
Fue comisionado con el Ministerio de Justicia. Bueno, ese señor aparece implicado, ese ministro.
Well, that man is implicated, that minister, and above all, a personal friend of Zelensky, known as Timur Mindish, a lifelong friend of Zelensky, founder of the Kvartal 95 studio, the television studio, through which Zelensky began not only his artistic career at the national level, but above all, his political career through the media. And another man named Alexander Zuckerman. These two are said to have participated as the organizers of this scheme. Basically, these men demanded 15% bribes from suppliers and any company linked to the electricity supply. So, they demanded 15% bribes, and then laundered the money as well, through phantom projects.
El blanqueo de esto también a través de obras fantasmas, por eso también el enojo con todo.
That's also why there's anger toward all these people. Because today, in the face of Russian attacks, Kiev is in the dark, since many of last year's pending projects were never completed. 15% of that money was allocated to bribes instead of public works. It was spent on corruption. This man, moreover, Timur Mindish, a close friend of Zelensky, was at one point raided by Ukrainian authorities, who documented his extravagant, almost pharaonic luxury at home. Even with photos of a bathroom featuring a golden toilet, everything gilded. By the way, what terrible taste, right, to relieve oneself in a golden toilet. Well, what a grotesque thing. But this was documented. The photos appeared on Ukrainian websites, even showing the mansion of this man who was involved in this corruption scheme.
Quien participó en este esquema de corrupción. Ambos, tanto Timur Mindish,
both Timur Mindish, a friend of Zelensky, and Alexander Zuckerman, as well as another one, the suspended minister Herman Malyshenko. The first two left Ukraine, escaping to Israel. Zuckerman is reported to be hiding in Israel. The other, Timur Mindish, apparently returned to Ukraine after a trip to Israel as well, but is said to have left the country in the last few hours, before this raid, heading to Turkey. A fugitive in Turkey. the delights of Ukrainian politics, of the mafia. It's not surprising. Before the war, European media described Ukraine as the most corrupt country in Europe. So this isn't surprising in that sense, but it is infuriating. These guys defecating in a golden toilet while people are dying at the front. More and more people, even their own countrymen, Ukrainians, supposedly their compatriots.
Compatriotas de ellos, ¿sí? Bueno, uno en Israel y otro en Turquía.
Well, one in Israel and another in Turkey. And Zelensky is under a lot of pressure. A fallen minister, a personal friend. And who started all this? Yes, the anti-corruption agency, but an anti-corruption agency led by none other than the United States and Europe. So this clearly represents an action initiated against Zelensky, right? To create pressure, to create political pressure regarding new elections, regarding his position in negotiations, and so on. Tomorrow we can present this in more depth, but I wanted to at least mention this corruption case, because it's also putting a lot of pressure on the Ukrainian leadership. Demolishers. In half an hour, Adrian Zelaya's broadcast begins on our sister channel, MP Geopolitics, with a retransmission here, Demolishing Myths. Tomorrow, as always, we'll have our usual Friday talk with Juan Antonio Aguilar, and afterward, Fernando Moragon with his own program. Please remember to help us out with a thumbs up and with your comments. Well, if you'd like to support us through memberships or PayPal, your help is of course very welcome. On DMP, the subscription, our sister channel, and if you'd like, also on our English channel, Demolishing Political Myths. Basically, the same critical analyses you see here, dubbed into English by artificial intelligence. That's our channel. Help us make it grow, so we can project our analyses beyond the Spanish-speaking world, basically to the rest of the world. With the images of Zelensky visiting Kherson, the people in Kherson, desperate, this was a few days ago. Every visit by Zelensky at this point is followed almost immediately by the fall of those cities. Well, with the images of Zelensky visiting Kherson yesterday, in the midst of this corruption scandal, in areas supposedly close to the front, though obviously not that close, signing flags. Well, we're wrapping up this broadcast until tomorrow, dear demolishers.
El día de mañana, queridos demoledores y demoledoras. Chao.